So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here. Good morning to those of you who are in a different time zone, including one of our panelists. Welcome, bienvenidas. My name is Nadia Rubai. I'm one of the co-directors of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or IGMAP, as we call it, at Binghamton University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on women of color leaders in atrocity prevention. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that Binghamton University sits on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee peoples, specifically the Onondaga and the Oneida, and that the US government's treatment of Indigenous peoples represents a past and an ongoing mass atrocity. I also want to call your attention before we start this webinar to two upcoming webinars. Next Friday, April 16th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, we'll be talking about the risks and the realities of mass atrocities facing Brazil's Indigenous peoples, featuring two Indigenous activists, a Brazilian legal scholar, and a Brazilian government official who works to protect their rights. Next month on Thursday, May 13th, also at 10 a.m., we will be co-hosting with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights a webinar focused on the mass atrocity killings and forced displacement and the man-made humanitarian disaster of mass starvation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Today's webinar will follow our established format. The moderators, myself and my colleague, Dr. Jenny Escobar, will use the first 45 minutes to an hour asking questions of our guest and encouraging dialogue among them. And then we'll open things up to questions from you. Please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. We do ask that when you submit your question, you also identify yourself and any organizational affiliation at that time. So now it's my pleasure to introduce an IGMAP, or an Institute of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention colleague and a friend, one of the Charles E. Scheidt Family Foundation postdoctoral fellows in atrocity prevention, Dr. Jenny Escobar, who will introduce today's topic and panelists. And as I mentioned earlier, we have one of our panelists with us. We're working on technical issues to bring the other one on with us as quickly as possible. So Dr. Escobar.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon. I will be speaking in Spanish for the Spanish-speaking audience and also to join our panelist, Francia Marquez. It's a pleasure for me to be here today speaking about this important subject on the contributions by women of color to prevention of atrocities and genocide in the world. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. The event's goal is to have a conversation and mostly to celebrate the efforts that many times go unheard in conversations in the prevention of atrocities, the voices of women, Black women in the world. This conversation, this event is so that we can discuss the work that Francia and Miranda have been doing throughout the years and to celebrate their work and see how we can support their work and continue to have prevention against genocide and mass atrocities. I will let the panelists themselves introduce themselves. However, just a few words to introduce Miranda Sheffield. Miranda Sheffield is a colleague and a friend who has been studying and working in the community for many, many years among Black communities and colored communities in Los Angeles and California, and in California in general. Miranda has worked for the rights of young people and children who have been in the foster care system in the United States. She has worked for victims of sexual exploitation in California and has played a central role to try and see how the community can continue to demand the police systems to take responsibility for the violence that has been committed and continues to be committed against Black communities in particular. Recently, she ran for candidate in the local elections with a very progressive platform, working in her community to see what the needs of this community in Pomona are. So in order to establish a very good agenda representing this community's needs. It is quite a pleasure to have you with us, Miranda. Thank you for being with us. Francia Marquez is also part of this panel. She is an Afro-Colombian leader who's been working not just for the Black communities in Colombia, but also she's been working transnationally on the rights of Black communities in the world. Francia Marquez has been a leader, an environmentalist, and now she's is running for president of Colombia. It is a pleasure to have you here with us so that you can tell us more about Afro-Colombian communities. What are their thoughts, visions, and practices against genocide and mass atrocities? What can you share with us about that and to give us some guidance for all those of us who work on this as well? So thank you very much. Let me first start with Miranda. I'm going to start with you, Miranda. It is our custom among people of color that we need to say where we are from and who we work with. So I will ask you so that people can see and understand where your work is coming from. Could you briefly tell us what communities inform your work to prevent atrocities, mass atrocities? So what community do you come from? What are the communities that inform the work that you do?
Hola, Jenny and guests and panelists. Thank you so much for having me on this wonderful panel. I'm so excited to be a part of it and learn and share different exchanges of knowledge with each other. So I appreciate this opportunity. To answer your question, my family is from the South of the United States by way of Mississippi, by way of New Orleans. I was born in New Orleans before I came to California. And so when I think about who really informs my work, I think about the Black women who have been like the matriarchs of my family, who I'm still learning more about and really diving deep into like what got them as far as they did, what has helped them to, take care of my family throughout all these years and generations of us. And I would also say, when I think about community and what inspires my work and what drives my work, I'm definitely rooted in Black feminist practices. And I think about the Conaby River Collective. It's definitely like a, driving manifesto type of report that really, a statement that was put out by a bunch of Black feminists in the 70s that really helps anchor me in how I do what I do. So those are the things I feel where I come from, who carries me, who helps me to like do this work continuously. I'm super thankful for the Black women who continue to do the things they do.
So Miranda, we use a lot of terms in this field. We at the Institute use the terminology of atrocity prevention, but others who work on similar kinds of issues use language of peace building, conflict resolution, social justice, racial justice, environmental justice. How do you define your work, and what are the atrocities that you're most focused on trying to prevent. So how do you define the atrocities? How do you define your work in prevention? And more generally, just how do you define your work?
Okay, Nadia, this is a 10-minute answer question because I looked up, this definition for atrocity because y'all wanted to get fancy and stuff. So I was like, okay, where are we going to go with this? Because I found it really interesting, with how we understand atrocities and how, like, most of the time when we locate the understanding about seeing mass atrocities, it's always seen outside of the West. It's always like the global South. It's always looked out, outwardly, rather than looking inwardly. And one of the, I think a paper that was written back by a human rights advocate that I really, really admire. He's a Kenyan human rights lawyer. He's based here in the US. He wrote a paper called Saviors, Savages. And he spoke to this metaphor of like how when we think about the context of human rights, conflict resolution, it's never calling to task what these things actually mean in the West and holding the West accountable. And I know that back in 2011, President Obama, he created something to address, he put together a resolution to like say, oh, here's the ways that we're going to address mass atrocities. And I think that framework and how, like, I think of like mass atrocities, and when I center women particularly, I think that it's really concerning to me that we really need to decolonize even what that means and how we understand those words, because they I don't think they always speak to like how the West is really complicit in a lot of like the issues that goes on in our region. So like what I think of, the fact, I think of like issues around Black infant maternity health issues, right? That's a mass atrocity that continues to go on. And I don't think people would look at it in that framework. And I also think about, the issues that have taken place here on the local level, where we have tons of folks who are constantly having to deal with, the police killings that are going on, and the Black trans folks, or Black trans women who are constantly having to deal with different types of atrocities. So for me, I think I would like to really bring to task the fact that I'm here located in the US and really calling out like before we can go out and try to be saviors for the world and all of these things, we really have to locate a lot of these atrocities that are happening right here in our backyard and really speaking to those issues and those conflicts that are taking place, particularly I think when we think about Black women and the issues that goes on with them. But I have so much more to say about that, but I don't want to be wordy.
That's okay. So I'm gonna let Jenny and Francia in the background. Others can't see them. The participants can't see them. They are trying very hard to sort out the technology and figure out a way for us to be able to engage in a conversation with Francia. But let me ask you another follow-up question related to that, Miranda. In the context of the United States, as you were talking about, your campaign issues and a lot of your activism have focused on some of these issues of police oversight and accountability, racial and economic justice, environmental justice, and public health. All of those are, if they're not handled well, those are risk factors for mass atrocities. Those are things that contribute. And we had a webinar in January, we actually had two of them, where we focused on prospects for atrocity prevention in the Biden-Harris administration. One focused on in the international arena, what we might expect to see changing there with the new administration, and one focused on the domestic policy arena. And so I'll ask Francia a little bit later about the international component, but I'd like you to maybe comment. We're a little over 100 days at this point. I think we're at 102, 103 days. What have you seen from the Biden-Harris administration that speaks to you in terms of effectiveness in preventing atrocities? And what would you be your one policy recommendation if you had the ear of someone in the administration that you'd like to see changed?
Well, for me, thank you for that question, Nadia. I think for me right now, the one of the things I've been really excited about, an appointment that has taken place in the Biden Harris administration, has been the appointment of Deb Haaland, who has become the Secretary of the Interior. I don't think folks realize how powerful that appointment is and the potential that it has to reckon with a lot of the historical harm that has taken place with our Indigenous community. And so when I think about something that's particularly, I'm not, I wasn't like a particularly someone who was gun-ho about this administration, right? But I recognize this is where we are, this is what we have to deal with. But having Deb Haaland be appointed as the Secretary of Interior for our country, it's saying, hey, we realize that we need to give those who were previously and always have been stewards of this land the opportunity to dictate how things are going to go. And I think that's a really exciting thing to see what Deb Haaland's doing. I like that Deb Haaland has already put together a task force to start searching for missing Indigenous women that have gone missing and disappeared. I think that's something that's really exciting to see coming out of her. I like the appointment of Marcia Fudge, who is the appointment for housing for HUD. And I think when you asked me, what is something that I would really like if I had the air, it would be wanting to do what they did with Deb Haaland, where particularly for Black folks and people of African descent, to say that we need to be able to address our own legacy of harm and do something that speaks to this in a real way. And I think reparations is always on the table. And so for me, it would be reparations can come in many different forms, but right now I think a focus is like, how do we, make sure that the land is being given back to folks and like giving folks the opportunity to prosper, but also wanting to create stuff that's actually infrastructure and policy that's sustainable for Black folks that have continuously having to go through, systemic injustices and harm because we're moving through a capitalist heteropatriarchy, system and stuff. So for me, I would love to see something where we took some of these. Here in California, we have a bill where we're really pushing to bring reparations and putting together a committee around that. But reparations to me is like extremely important. And just to add more to this, like really expanding upon this, is that I really believe right now, this is a great moment to really test the parameters of capitalism. And when I think about mass atrocities, I think about how the economic violence that takes place in these situations and how it's utilized against particularly Black women. And for me, I would like to have an opportunity to really grow what's called the solidarity economy. And so for someone who's like a Jan Helen, the Helen who's like in her position, who has opportunity to do stuff when it comes to the financial challenges in our country, I would really be looking to what does it look like for us to be very innovative with putting forward some real, I know the government is going to be the government, but still, like, what does it mean to put forward some anti-capitalist practices to move particularly, Black women? And I think having this like Black feminist economy where, the folks who have been the most hard hit are able to now, we're building from the ground up an economy that addresses, I think, some of these larger atrocities and conflicts that have taken place. And how can this administration do that?
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to return to some of those issues that you raised related to reparations and related to innovative approaches. But I think we have at least a method by which we can engage Francia in the conversation. I'm going to turn things over to Jenny at this time.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por su
Well, good
paciencia.
afternoon, and thank you all for your patience while we try to establish connection with Francia. We are having technical difficulties, but what we are going to do is for Francia can actually hear us and see us, but we cannot hear her. So what we will do is I will ask a question of Francia, who can hear me, and then I will be repeating as much as I can what she is repeating, so you can hear her voice through me, and so she can share all her knowledge and bring it to this conversation. So again, Francia, for being with us on this day. The first question I wanted to ask you, and I know that for you, your ancestral knowledge and the knowledge of your own community has been something which is extremely important and has promoted your leadership for the rights of Black communities. I would like to know how your knowledge, your ancestral and community knowledge have impacted some way your work in atrocity prevention.
Dice Francia.
Excellent. Francia says that she sends an ancestral a warm hug to me and everyone who is participating in this very important conversation. She is actually talking and recognizing the historical legacy of injustices committed against Afro peoples and racism that exists nowadays. That is why this conversation is so important to have this day. We have been able to continue this long fight and to see each other as an extended family, to consider this a collective fight, and to remember the Ubuntu, which is what motivates us to continue this very long battle that we have been fighting.
Creo que a nosotros digamos, tener claro y hacer uso de la memoria histórica de lo que han padecido nuestros mayores y mayoras, yo creo que ha sido lo que nos ha dado fuerza también para no aceptar esas condiciones e intentar transformar. Creo que tenemos una memoria ancestral de la resistencia, del cimarronaje muy fuerte, y yo creo que esto nos ha dado fuerza para seguir entendiendo que la libertad no se acabó, no llegó, perdón, con la abolición de la esclavitud, sino que es un trabajo que todavía seguimos haciendo y teniendo una plena conciencia de eso. Creo que es lo que nos ha permitido poder avanzar desde los saberes ancestrales, comunitarios, desde la espiritualidad, desde ahí hemos parado para demandar en este país garantías a los derechos de la población afrodescendiente, por supuesto en articulación con los pueblos indígenas, con los pueblos campesinos, con quienes tejemos en la lucha y en la resistencia.
Bueno, gracias, Francia. Lo que le ha ayudado también es tener claro.
What has helped her is to, and I'm not sure if I'm on mute. No, I'm not. It's helped to remember clearly and have his historical memory of their elders and the resistance that has been done, because things didn't end with the end of slavery. This legacy continues, and the work to liberate continues as well. And it's the spirituality, ancestral powers that have helped her do this work.
So I'm going to ask a question of Francia, and we're going to try when she responds. Jenny, if you can hold the phone close enough to your microphone, and we'll see if the interpreters can hear well enough to be able to do the simultaneous interpretation. So Francia, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am sorry that the technology is complicating matters. I want to ask you the same question that I asked of Miranda when you were first joining us. So in January of this year, the Institute held 2 webinars focused on the prospects for atrocity prevention or more effective atrocity prevention in the Biden-Harris administration. In one session, we focused on domestic issues and another one international. So for you, I'd like to talk about US policy toward Colombia. And in particular, because I know you reached out to Vice President Kamala Harris shortly after she was sworn in as Vice President with a public letter, an open letter, in which you called attention to, among other things, how Afro-Colombian and indigenous people are tired of being in the middle of violent confrontations, and asking for a direct meeting with her. And I'm curious if that meeting has occurred or will occur, and what you're seeing as positive signs in the Biden-Harris administration or disturbing signs, and what you would like to see in the US administration. And Jenny, if you can try to hold the phone close to your microphone, we'll see if this will work.
I think the question is very pertinent. First of all, the relationship between the United States diplomatically has been maybe okay, but neoliberal policies of the United States are implemented in our country and directly affect the rights of Afro-descendant and indigenous communities, because they come from the US, they continue expropriations and hurting the environment because they want to exploit natural resources, especially because we live in these territories that will help develop the country. We have the port of Buenaventura. More than 80% of Afro-descendants live there, and a great part of the economy of the country goes through that, but people live in misery. It's like a war. It's if you start looking at it, it's deep. We have a lot of violence. We have violence because of geopolicies, international policy, human rights violations perpetrated by the US. Of course, it's clear that we have hope with the Biden administration. Because Colombia implemented Plan Colombia for 10 years using resources of the United States to move forward to try and eradicate drug trafficking, but it didn't consider the human rights of the most impoverished communities of the country, because drug trafficking continued even though our communities have suffered forced displacement, murder of their leaders, and a number of human rights violations that were not protected, which is why the fact that today a Afro-descendant woman becoming vice president of the United States can make a difference. The way that Afro-Americans expect, hope that Kamala Harris as vice president may make a difference in the structural violence that there are people live under in the United States. We have the same hope, which is why I dared write this public letter asking for guarantees for peace. The government that we have now has committed to destroying these possibilities, but we want to live in peace. And that has translated into a humanitarian crisis that is affecting more Black women and Indigenous people, even former combatants who agreed to this peace agreement are being murdered. We believe the voice of the United States matters here in Colombia. So we hope that the government of the United States goes to the side of a policy for life. So far, the Vice President Kamala Harris has not replied. We are hoping she will, but we'd like more than her reply. We hope that her policies, their policies, can help and guarantee the rights of the populations that are impoverished in our country, to guarantee peace and to take care of the environment. We've heard that President Biden has committed to a global environmental policy. So we hope we will see that reflected in the policies of the United States in our territories.
Thank you. Thank you very
Nadia,
much.
is it possible for me to respond to?
Absolutely. We would love that.
Okay. Francia, it's so beautiful to see you on the call, and I enjoy your comments and everything that you're saying. I wanted to, in reference to what you said about this, you're right, that there's a lot of hope for us here as Black folks in the US around seeing stuff and representation. A lot of folks are excited about having Kamala Harris. I wanted to know on your side, Francia, especially with you becoming the president, moving towards wanting to become the president of Colombia, how do y'all, like, a lot of us here who are like leftists really push back on like Kamala Harris, because we feel that she was really a cop at the end of the day. Like, she was someone who, her representation that she's done during her time that she served here in California, and even whatever, that we've always kind of like pushed back at what she represents, because even though she's a Black woman, there's still contradictions in how her leadership has taken place and what she has done. And how does that like affect, and influence, when we really pull away just the representation? How do you like understand those, conflicts and things with how you, come to this understanding? Because we had Obama for 8 years. Yes, go Obama, but he was definitely a part of a lot of harm that took place here in the US and also on the global scale. So I just wanted to see like how important, is this representation and understanding things.
I think you're right in what you're saying, and we also question that. We questioned Obama, we questioned Kamala Harris because of what she did when she was a prosecutor, because most jails are mostly filled with Black people. But today she's the vice president of the United States, one of the biggest countries in the world. So somehow she has something to do with the policies that will affect the rest of the world. So what we are doing is, at least I sent her a letter, and the letter said that we'd like to congratulate her for her winning, but don't forget that that sits on the shoulders of women before her, such as, for instance, the Black Panther women, even. And if you think about it, lots of Black Panther women are still rotting away in the United States prison. So we do acknowledge and we do know that she is privileged, but it comes on the shoulders of the struggle. So our responsibility today is to have people understand that this privilege has been gained because of others' sacrifice. Others that came before us, our grandparents who made this path.
No, aquí estás todavía.
I think my internet is crashing. I had this experience once with Angela Denges, and I asked her, so what did she feel when Obama came to the White House? And she said to me, 100 years ago, Obama could have never become president of the United States because even this is a man who today has shown us that we've made it. His skin is black. And 100 years ago, he could have not been president. He became president because of our struggle before him. They need to be reminded of that because here, for instance, we have Black people in government here as well. But in spite of that, they do not vindicate the rights of our people. So they need to acknowledge this. They need to be reminded because they did not get there alone and by themselves. They got there because of others and the struggles that others brought. So today they should use that in service of dignity and freedom for their people. So that's what we wanted to do by sending this letter to Kamala. We hope that we are heard, and we hope that they can help us build in the United States, in Colombia, and in other places of the world, a life that is less full of suffering. But let's do this together.
Por tu respuesta.
Thank you, Francia. Thank you for your reply. One of the questions that I wanted to bring to this conversation, and which is discussed now, is the involvement of Black women in electoral policies. Both of you, Miranda, I'd like to ask you first. Did you run for local elections in your city in order to represent your city? Francia, obviously, she is campaigning for the presidency of Colombia. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the participation of Black women in this electoral policy as part of the work of prevention of atrocities and as part of the work that has been done towards the freedom and the right of Black communities and communities of color? Miranda, perhaps you can start.
Yes, thank you for that question, Jenny. Really, really great question to ask. When I ran for office last year in 2020, it was definitely, wanting to represent my community on a local level because I feel the local has a lot of power to bring about change and to, put forward some like really alternative practices for our community. And so, that has been like really exciting for me to be able to do. And like my platform, when I ran for office, here in Pomona, where I live, my community is mostly, it's people of color, right? But it's a heavy Latino community. And something that I've been able to understand is that, it's very important for me, even when I was running for office, to be able to show that while I was a Black woman running in a heavy, Latinx community, there's a decent amount of Black folks that still live here, but it's still disproportionately, Latino. I made sure to show intersections that, yes, I'm a Black woman who's running in the city and I'm wanting to represent our Latino community, but I wanted to show that tu lucha is mi lucha, and like really bringing that understanding home that there's a lot of like, even though we have different struggles, there's still a lot of things around housing, around wanting to make sure that we have the support for our youth and our families, that those issues are there and that we need to bring them together and to show them. And then to add on to your other part about this, need of seeing Black women represented in politics and the electoral process, I will say right now, there's been a whole push, right? We've seen like the Stacey Abrams, now that we have Kamala Harris, Black women are like the hot ticket right now. And all of these women behind the scenes that have actually been making moves here in the States, which is like Simone Sanders, some other really cool players that have been a part of this. But my thing for me is that some of me pushes back against this whole thing of like Black women are saving our democracy in some ways, because I feel that dynamic and that discussion, it only wants to consume like the parts of us that are not as radical. It doesn't consume, back in 2008, Cynthia McKinney and Rosa Clemente ran as a Green Party ticket. And there was no rah, 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 let's go ahead and do this whole Black woman supporting folks thing. That wasn't there. There was the same type of energy being put behind when you had folks who were Black women that were embracing the socialist platform, Black women that were saying, we have alternatives outside of like, this neoliberal capitalist type of framework. So for me, when we say, let's celebrate Black women, which I'm always going to be in favor of, and I'm always going to be excited about, it's like what Black folks do makes folks comfortable, what's consumable, all of those things. So I think it's important that, we celebrate our work because it needs to be celebrated because we have been left out. But it's also important to realize how that celebration is taking place and who is considered like important enough to lift up as we are seeing this expansion of Black women taking really beautiful positions of power, but then leaving others out of that equation. So yes.
Great, thank you. I think Jenny and Francia are once again troubleshooting technology. So I'm going to follow up with that, Miranda. And I actually we're going to go switch to questions from the audience and the attendees shortly. But I want to come back to something you mentioned in one of your earlier responses regarding reparations. So last night at Binghamton University, our Harriet Tubman Center hosted an event that was co-sponsored by the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention that included two Black women speaking about the road to reparations and reconciliation. And in the context of the United States and its treatment of people of Indigenous and African descent in particular. There was a lot of discussion about truth and reconciliation processes, about the possibility of various forms of reparation. And so I'd like you to kind of delve a little bit deeper. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but talk about what you see as the value of those kinds of processes and what ideas you have for meaningful reparations that you think are possibilities. And you can focus on in the context, you don't have to think for the whole nation. You can focus, if you like, on the local community context where you're based, if you like.
Yeah, for me, when I think about this idea around reparations, it's always important to find out how can we center and uplift Black women, when we're talking about these various of things and who we are wanting to target. And I know historically, we can look and see that it was in law, and that it was something that was written during the time of slavery, that Black women's bodies were used to basically be folks to breed more children to go into slavery. Like it's written into law in different parts of the country that after, there wasn't as many slave ships coming into this country, there then to be the slave owners and these different slave folks begin to take time to say, okay, how else can we ensure that we have the, workforce here to take care of stuff. And you can see in law that this was something that was taking place, where Black women's bodies were being commodified to help continue this legacy of slavery. So reparations, when I think of it, is thinking of it, what does it mean to address that specifically? That how Black women's bodies, Dorothy Roberts talks about the killing of the Black body. And I think that whole discussion that she lifts up is how Black women's bodies were just used, you know, for production, for the use of slavery. What does it mean to, you know, address that systemic harm and to talk about what reparations look like for Black women? I think that's a conversation, you know, when I think even in the context domestically here, but also when we're trying to tie that into the, like, you know, human rights UN framework, about how does that conversation even connect to, like, you know, our, you know, rural women that are also having different challenges, and what that, how we make those connections. I think about, you know, how there's a lot of connection that can be made there. And the alternatives to me, which is something I'm very rooted in, is the solidarity economy, and like how we even through the framework, the understanding of addressing reparations, it can't be a capitalist solution. It has to be something that moves us outside of this framework. And for me, it's like looking at to, you know, what does it mean to create more cooperatives for, you know, Black folks? What does it mean for us to explore, um, you know, things that provide more community land trusts for our communities and things like that? That to me is much more of a meaningful response than just plainly saying, we're going to give y'all some land. We're not going to give you resources what to do with the land and how to cultivate the land, but we're just going to give you some land. No, or just pay you out. We're going to write you a check. I don't think that's meaningful. I think when we're really talking about resolution and stuff, let's really talk through some frameworks that are rooted in anti-capitalist values that can move us closer to a different way of living in a radical Black imagination for our people and for our folks.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm going to let Jenny ask one more question, and then we're going to switch to questions from the participants, from the attendees. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A area on the bottom, at the bottom of your screen.
Hola, bueno,
Yes,
desafortunadamente,
hi. Unfortunately, due to technological problems, we have lost our dear Francia in this conversation, but she has left us with a message of cooperation, solidarity, and asking that we continue to look at Colombia and its situation as a example of a fight. And she is currently in her presidential campaign. She has been facing quite a bit of violence. There are so many people who are against her campaign. As an activist, as a woman of color, she asks for your solidarity in that sense. And she said that before she left us. But to close this up, this part of this conversation, Miranda, I was hearing you talk about you're giving us a vision of what it would look like to have justice for Black communities and communities of color. I have heard the examples you have given regarding providing land to people and to have a cooperative economy. So can you give us that complete imaginarium as to how we can not only do justice for communities of color, but for the rest of the world as well, and how the rest of us in the world can understand and learn from the imaginary that is growing in the past few years, especially in the Black movement in the US, that is pushing us to leave behind institutions and practices of the past to bring about something completely different. Can you talk to us about that vision? And would you tell us what are the lessons that the rest of the world can learn from the vision that comes from the Black imaginary and knowledge?
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate the question. A lot of my research when I was studying for my master's was looking at maroons and looking at how a lot of fugitive slaves, escape from the plantation and begin to go about forming their own lives, coincide while the slavery was still taking place. And when I think about the Black radical imagination and how we think about what it means to put forward this type of alternative, I really do look to this group because these were folks who were in Colombia. Maroons were folks who were fugitive slaves escaping off the plantation and were setting up their own societies and own ways of living and being and growing. And they were coming all out of different places, here in the States, in the South, in North Carolina, Mississippi, New Orleans, when the uprising and the revolts were taking place, you had Maroons out here doing things in Haiti, in Jamaica, everywhere you had some Maroons who were escaping and trying to forge a different way of being. So that really, really informs, how things are. And I think that came with a lot with how when they escaped, some of them in Jamaica, like they went into wanting to have recognition and how far recognition got them and the challenges with that, right? And then here in the States, there was more of like a irritation to a lot of the slave colonies because they were constantly, on they were just always on the run. And I don't think those histories are lifted up enough. So um to answer like the question around like what does it mean for the Black movement right here, I know one thing that roots me, Jenny, is I really believe that particularly as a Black feminist, when Black women get free, everyone gets free. And it's something that we all can be able to capitalize off of and to benefit from. And then also like this is a time right now where this week and these last couple weeks I've been heavy around it. There's a George Floyd, trial that's taking place, and I think that that's just been something, I think even with him being convicted as an abolitionist, I think it's something that doesn't really speak to the injustices. I think white supremacy in the US, I saw this and I agree with it, is that they will sacrifice one of their own to uphold the good of the structure. So I think that's what we're probably going to see. He may get convicted, and it's more of a sacrifice than it is about it's not an indignation of the very system that we have to continuously move through. And so, wanting to put forward some alternatives as we're constantly having to move with these injustices, I would say is that, the one thing that I've been really pushing forward is like, how do we create alternative economics, on our local level to help support our people? And I do feel like the solidarity economy is something that speaks to how we help prevent mass atrocities and like help give people more opportunities to center people in the ways that we do our things rather than profit and rather than production. And so if we had more opportunities to engage in this way where we were more centered on the good and the well-being of our people rather than wanting to pursue relationships based off of profit and production, I think it would move us into a different direction than we're currently having to be faced with right now.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm going to draw some questions or a question from the audience. One is from a student, Celia Woodruff, who is a news writer for the student newspaper at Binghamton University, who'd like to know what kind of advice you have for how people can take what you're talking about today related to atrocity prevention into their daily lives or the conversations that they have. And in particular, what students in particular who want to get more involved what you would recommend to them in terms of organizations or programs you'd refer them to or activities?
I think that's a great question. I think for me, that would be, you know, to understand more about these atrocities. I think it's always good to like change the framework of how we define what atrocities are. And, a big thing right now that's kind of happening is like the whole, the trying to shift and challenge the Biden administration around how they're handling the crisis at the border, and wanting to bring attention to the fact that y'all are still in some ways having to deal with this where these folks are being kept while they're waiting to be heard and their cases are being brought up and as they're waiting to be reunited. I think those are like issues that are really great to be a part of. And I also think, you know, the we have to see atrocities are definitely connected to a lot of like local issues that are taking place. The fact that, you know, uh, folks may be living in situations where they're experiencing some type of food desert, and like the issues that are going on with that and how we find more opportunities to engage our community to show up and to support, um, having more community gardens and stuff like that. But for me, I think, there's a lot of different ways folks can get involved with these issues. I know that Black Lives Matter is doing what it needs to do to address some of these things. I think on a global scale that has been happening. I know that here in my area, we have lots of work where there's, folks trying to, get more involved, not just with the local politics, but also wanting to build more progressive grassroots movement. I was endorsed by an organization called Our Revolution and also DSA that have done some really great things to push, how we do the work that we do. So I think there's a lot of different ways for folks to get engaged. And I think it's perfectly okay to frame mass atrocities in a way that speaks to your local challenges and helps you to engage more on things.
Gracias,
Thanks, Miranda.
Miranda. Ah, em, quería preguntarte un poquito más sobre lo que empezaste a hablar.
Miranda, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you were saying earlier. How do we bring a network of support to communities that may not have the same view and perspective in terms of what is justice or what vision is to for prevention of atrocities? A network of support which lead us to connect to people who have different experiences, different views, different collective views and experiences in general. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities that come up when we create this support network and this cooperation network? We know that grassroots movements do a lot. We know there's a difference between people who support someone, supports by bringing a message, and there are people who support by sacrificing something beyond, that is maybe their lives, giving their lives or for their community. Can you tell us a little bit more about your view? How did you see this cooperation in solidarity with the different groups? What are the challenges that come up from that for prevention of atrocities or justice in general?
I think that it's always difficult when you're trying to build coalition with folks to bring everyone together for a common good. But I think what helps is that it's okay to come to the understanding that when you have someone who may be environmental justice, which is Francia, who was doing really great work around uplifting those struggles and speaking to that, but also doing it as a Black woman, right? And then you have folks who are fighting on police brutality, you have folks who are fighting on immigration, you have folks who are fighting on gender violence, justice, and all of these things. That's why the Kimberly Crenshaw, when she came up with intersectionality, was so important for us, because what it allow us and what it allots us is this really beautiful opportunity, I believe, to build upon this really amazing way of saying we all may not agree on what these issues are, but we agree that we have a beautiful solution, right? That we're moving in that spirit and that way of going through things. So it's hard sometimes to do these things because everyone wants to, have an answer and to do things. But I think having collective decision-making processes helps move this so beautifully, having consistency building, having a way where, we have community agreements about how we're going to move stuff on a larger scale and move us into a direction that has really beautiful solutions. But I know that what people have to get comfortable with as we continue to aspire to get to a different type of reality, a different type of alternative, is that we have to get comfortable with not always being necessarily in agreement, and that it's okay to have a beautiful struggle as we're processing some of our solutions. And conflict does lead us to conflict, within the framework of wanting to not cause physical harm and things of that nature. But conflict, I think, can lend us an opportunity in retrospect to aspire to, different solutions and things of that nature. Assata Shakur is one of my favorite folks, and she was very adamant about political education when you read her autobiography. And she talks about how, she was someone who would go really, really hard around this whole, I know what I know it. And she had comrades that would encircle her and challenge some of her thoughts and to, hold her accountable for no, you may need to look a little bit more deeper in that. And so I think it's important to have circles around us and how we, build out these different grassroots movements and stuff and feel comfortable being really engaged with. For me, Jenny, I need to understand that right now, just as it's important to get justice on the streets of Pomona, the streets of Los Angeles, and in California, is just as important for me to recognize that Palestinians are worthy of every and anything that they need in order to be flourishing in their region. I feel the same exact way when I think about the issues that are taking place in Dubai, with women and with those issues, and how everything is definitely connected. My struggle is definitely connected to those who are moving in India and other parts of the world. In Colombia, Francia, her struggle is my struggle, and how we are able, the more we do that, the more we uplift that, is where I feel the beauty comes out of how we deal with things and putting forward a different type of reality.
So a couple of questions, Miranda, from the attendees relate to what you were just talking about, this kind of transnational solidarity among women of color in particular. And so Sela Kingoro from Kenya asks, how can women of color in different parts of the world harness their strengths in preventing mass atrocities, not just in the US, but throughout the world? And another comment or question from Patricia Rodriguez mentions the circumstances in Colombia and the reactivation of violence by the paramilitary and the military, and the need for this international and transnational solidarity, particularly around issues of violence against women. So what have you seen as effective strategies for building that kind of solidarity?
I know right now in the US, we have not enacted the violence against women. That's a really big issue, that it hasn't been enacted, and that we're actually one of the more, when we think about being rated as far as how we do when it comes to gender justice and the policies that we have for that, they're not necessarily rating us pretty high in that aspect. So I think a women's right international framework goes a very long way And I think to speak to this is that, you know, something that I had read, I think us being able to put together going to a body like the UN and being able to show that what's taking place or like the legacy, one of the things I put a lot of paper that I had written about was that something I mentioned earlier was that, you know, there were historically a lot of, you know, Black women who were used for breeding and like our bodies were commodified for the benefit of like, you know, this country. I also recognize that in uh, Korea, you know, there were a lot of comfort women who were also to this day are experiencing, you know, injustices because they haven't, it's still a problem for, you know, Japan and other actors who are a part of this issue to recognize the part that they had to play in the abuses that took place with comfort women. And I see like the historical issues that took place with Black women and the issues that took place with comfort women as being very intersectional and being very important to lift up in like a more international framework. And how we understand those things, I think will help us, you know, grow. And I think we need to do more of that. We need to, you know, take more time. One of the my favorite shows I just watched is Lovecraft Country. I would definitely recommend it for everyone. But they took time to really show like you had this Afrofuturism, beautiful stuff taking place, right? And then you had like the historical legacy that was taking place with Comfort Woman. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. This is so beautiful. And so for me, I think the arts have a part to play in this when we think about what those solutions look like. I think, you know, being able to have a, you know, international framework that we can bring to the body like the UN with the different councils that are represented within that would go a very long way for us as a group and as a people.
Great. And I assume you were referring to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or what we refer to as CEDAW, that the United States has signed but never ratified.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, Jenny, I may have cut you off.
No, sí, pues sí quería preguntar
Well,
otra cosa.
I did want to ask something else, but the conversation was can be continued among us. Miranda or Nadia, perhaps you have something to say about that, because one of the ideas about bringing this up now is that many times the roles that we as women have in general and as women of color is that we bring our entire self to the work that we're doing. Miranda, I love that you said that you introduce yourself first as a mother. I'm the mother, and then I'm an organizer, a community organizer. So we list our different roles, the roles we play in our private life and in our collective and community life. For many of us, these roles aren't divided, aren't separate, which is against the traditional ways in which work is understood on justice and prevention. This is one of the teachings I think that women in general and women of colors in particular can bring. But I guess that's something I wanted to discuss further. Your role as a mother, for example, or as a sister, your role in the family, how does that affect your work, your vision? How does it influence it? How do you work on prevention? How do you present yourself to the world?
I have been really, I think if you were to ask me that 5 years ago, like being a mom, even now, being a mother is like a blessing. It's an honor. It's a great opportunity to have when I think about how I inform the things I do. But I also know with being, because I have a lot of beautiful friends who are like queer, trans parents and stuff of that nature. I really have been right now, Jenny, thinking through this, you know, even just pushing myself to like think through what this mother role means and how, like, what it stands for is, you know, in this whole trope, I think that sometimes gets put on Black women is that, like, we're the superheroes of our community, but also where's the love, you know, at the end of the day. But I think for me, I love being a mother. I think it definitely influences my work because I feel like the most revolutionary thing I'm doing is being a parent and wanting to bring forth a different type of reality for my daughter that is not rooted in harm, that's not rooted in violence, that's not rooted in you know, things that will lead to her like ultimate demise. I'm really wanting her to have um, a opportunity to live and to grow and to be where she's having her own experience as a within her own radical imagination, and she's able to embrace, you know, the things that she wants as a child, and being able to put forward reciprocity, you know, within a relationship. I am from the South. I come from, you know, Black women who laugh at me when I say these things and find it to be funny that I'm trying to give my child agency, autonomy. It's just not a thing. It's just not. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You need to like sit that child down and handle her the way she needs to be handled. So it's all like, this is all new in how I'm trying to do it. But I know that it's for the benefit of, you know, wanting to bring some children into the world that will show up differently. And this is what they ultimately don't realize. But this is what they fought for, you know, to have children who like, you know, are showing up differently. My daughter, she probably would be like tripping if I say this, but you know, she's not going to go to Bingham anytime soon because I tell all her business. You know, she's 16, she's wanting to date. And so I have, as a mother, wanted to give her different examples of what it means to enter into relationships and how those things are. And one of the books I recommended to her was a book called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. And I think those are really they're overlooked, but I think they're like little beautiful key steps and the direct ways of like how we talk about things spiraling out of control on a massive level, like what we can do to help, you know, our families and our loved ones reach different levels of having relationships. And I think relationships have such a strong part to play in how we prevent so much, you know, and that's something I'm really pushing for.
So I think you've, in many ways, perhaps assuaged the concerns that this one attendee wrote in their question, because I think they typed it in. It's an anonymous attendee, typed it in early on, in response to some of your first remarks, where you said before we start to try to help others overseas, we should address the ongoing atrocities in the United States. And the person interpreted that as kind of a call to isolationism, and I think in some of your other comments, you've made it pretty clear that you are very much taking a global perspective of solidarity and of collaboration and seeing the connections. But maybe you could just speak to how you think at a policy level, the US should be prioritizing and balancing the atrocities that are occurring domestically and internationally.
Yeah, I definitely I think when I speak to the US, you know, not being so quick to go out and be we're wanting to go and help folks, and but then we are not able to call out what's happening in our own backyard is more what I'm speaking to. It's not saying that the US doesn't have a responsibility and a role to play, and it's especially in particular, I will center Central America. Like the US has been directly involved in the destabilization of Honduras, of Nicaragua, of, you know, Guatemala, like all of those countries the US has had a part to play. And I think there needs to be a reckoning with the US as being a really bad actor in these regions. But for me, like I said, um, there was a paper that was written by Professor Matua, where he talks about savages, saviors, and victims. And he uses a metaphor to talk about who gets to call who a victim, who gets to call who the savior, and who is the person who's a savage, you know, who's painting these different things. And I think it's important for us to think through that. Like, yes, we need to respond to the issues that are going on, and the US needs to be the main person putting forward the resources for that. But we also have to realize who's conducting these roles, and how are these roles influencing the solutions that we need for ourselves. And I don't want it to be the US just does what it needs to do here in our own backyard. I think, like I said earlier, our struggles are connected together. And I think the US can do way much more to address the issues that are taking place with our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and uplifting that in a more real way. When Black Lives Matter was taking place here, you had different Palestinian folks who were telling a lot of organizers how to wash out the gas tear in their face by using milk through sending tweets and stuff. So the love and the solidarity is there, and I think it's going to continue to be there. And I think the US needs to be held to account. Just on the other side is that, you know, we don't do well with addressing police brutality here. We don't do well with addressing issues around infant mortality rates for Black women. You know, we're still struggling in those areas. And we definitely don't do well. I live in Los Angeles County. We do not do well with addressing issues that are related to houselessness, you know? And so all of those things, and let me, and then let me just say this, and then I'll like leave this question alone. Back in the 80s, we had the failed war on drugs. That was a connection that connected to what was taking place in the streets of LA with the crack epidemic, and then how this connects directly to Colombia and to other countries, how the importing of these drugs. So for me, that to me is a very Colombia, Nicaragua, and all that to me is like a very direct correlation of how the US has failed to, you know, be a perpetrator of harm, you know, and even what was taking place when everyone was experiencing all this like issues with overdoses and drug use, and, you know, crack was hitting the streets as hard as it was. The US did not respond to that as a humanitarian issue. They responded to it like we were in a war zone in our community. And so what I challenge folks, and how I would like folks to understand, is that there's a lot going on in this. I mean, it's historically and even now, there's a lot that's going on that the US, and particularly our different agencies like the FBI, the CIA, all these players that end up going and being like, you know, saviors, quote unquote, to do different things, have a reckoning that they have to face with. And I really do think that, you know, folks need to take time to make those connections and understand those different legacies.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Miranda, por tus respuestas.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for your answers and for addressing the issue of the collective and the individual, and addressing from your work from that perspective. And then, so in closing, I would like to ask you that to briefly, because we're running out of time, but what would be your suggestion? This is from Dr. Beth Jaworski, who works for the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, a social psychologist, my colleague. Her question is, what would be strategies that you could provide us for sustaining your energies and nurturing your souls to continue engaging in this work? What are your strategies that you can share with us?
For me right now, it's becoming a floral ranger. You know, I like to put flowers together right now. It's actually been very beautiful and therapeutic for me. I would love to show y'all these flowers that I put together, but they're pretty dead, and sadly, but for me, it's been putting together flowers. And I also think when I think about women like Dr. Joy DeGruy, who's put together the post-traumatic slave syndrome, those are really great ways of how we understand PTSD in a different framework. But then also, I think for me, in some ways, people don't always have the resources to access mental health, unfortunately, like they need to. In my community, I find like what's been helpful is like being very intentional with setting time aside to have a meal that is warming, that is meaningful, with folks that you consider to be exciting and thoughtful. I also think sustaining yourself is important to do this when not in the way of like this commodification of self-care that I think has kind of taken on, but more of like, what does it mean for me to collectively, what does it mean for me to show up in spaces where I'm intentionally being vulnerable and I'm intentionally engaging and wanting to get healing, even when it's the most uncomfortable for me. And doing it in the spirit of, I know that I moved through maybe my own privileges. I know that I moved through maybe some of my own challenges, but I know that me being able to face some of these things directly is a part of my healing and the healing for others that I surround myself with. So I would say that.
Thank you so much, Miranda. We have other questions that we simply won't have time to get to, and we were getting to the substance of them and not reading the intros to all of them, which were thank yous for your time and for sharing your perspectives and your experience and for the work that you do. I do want to express apologies to the attendees that we had the technical difficulties with Francia's participation. We will try to bring her back in some other format at another time, because I think we just got a glimpse of what we could learn from her, and that would be quite valuable. So thank you so much, Miranda, for the work that you're doing and for being willing to share it with us today. And a quick reminder to those who are still with us, we do have another webinar a week from today in the morning, though, at 10 o'clock Eastern time, where we'll be focused on the risks and realities of mass atrocities facing Brazil's indigenous populations. And this is a long-standing issue, and one that is at a peak level and a heightened level now in the context of COVID and in the context of the current administration there. So we hope to see you there joining us. And thanks so much, Miranda. Thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks, Jenny, for organizing this. We really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to more opportunities to share these different frameworks and solutions and different ways of being. So I appreciate you, and I hope everyone has a wonderful, beautiful evening.
Thank you.
Exactly. Have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend, everyone. Take care.